Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the start of day 2 of the Bloomsbury Fantasy School. We are starting with the wonderful Carolyne Larrington, who is going to give some opening remarks on the Oxford School of Fantasy, and then we're going to proceed to the next 2 speakers for the main first morning session. So,
thank you. And, yep, let's see. Yeah. So I touched a little bit on this topic in my opening remarks yesterday as to why Oxford is the home of fantasy. It's a claim we like to make in Oxford, and Stuart and I have spent some years trying to promulgate this idea to the outside world, and indeed our successful sponsorship with Bloomsbury perhaps suggests that we have had some success in this. So why can Oxford make this claim? And as always in Oxford, the question that asks itself is, and why doesn't Cambridge have a comparable tradition? It may be because Cambridge is a much more science-oriented university in the last 100 years, but there may be some other reasons as well, which I'll be touching on. So it's a long tradition from at least the mid-19th century. If we date the beginning of Oxford fantasy from Lewis Carroll, who was a mathematics don at Christ Church and who composed Alice in Wonderland and the follow-up Alice Through the Looking Glass for the daughters of Dean Liddell. There are many writers who lived, taught, studied in Oxford, and who were aware of the tradition, and in some ways it's kind of mushrooming, that although Lewis Carroll was out on his own, although Tolkien was somebody who picked up on the tradition from William Morris, as we heard yesterday, and of course William Morris first encountered ideas about fantasy, particularly Arthurian fantasy, while he was a student here in Oxford. And as more and more Oxford people began to write fantasy, there were more and more people for future generations to be reading. I also want to talk a little bit about first order and second order effects before getting on to medievalist fantasy. So does the medieval infrastructure of Oxford and the highly medieval English course as it was up until I guess about the 1950s, has that had some effect in creating the kind of buzz that is Oxford fantasy? Oh, I keep using this clicker, which doesn't seem to work. So first of all, we have to talk about people who taught in the university, and I've divided them up rather arbitrarily in this way. So we have Carroll, who I've already talked about. We have Tolkien, about whom we heard so much yesterday, including his basic training as a classicist that Beppe was talking about. And we have C.S. Lewis as well. And here, perhaps one of the most important things to note is Tolkien's influence on the English syllabus. So during the course of the 1920s and 1930s, once Tolkien was firmly established in the faculty, there were various moves within the English faculty to introduce such startling things as modern literature. And Tolkien was very clear that English literature and English language study should look as much like the classics as possible. And that meant lots of philology, lots of language work, lots of training in the ancient forms of the language and reading of the ancient literature. And in a sense, anybody who could read could probably make their way through a modern novel. So they didn't need the same kind of tuition. I rather doubt whether Ulysses is something you can just pick up and read like that. But of course, that wasn't exactly on the syllabus at that particular point. C.S. Lewis's interests were slightly later, but I'm not going to say very much more about Lewis because we're about to hear a whole lecture on him from Simon in a moment. Then we have a whole slew of students. And we have, I think this is quite an interesting phenomenon here, that we have, first of all, a set of older generation authors, Diana Wynne Jones, Susan Cooper, and slightly younger Philip Pullman, all of whom studied English in Oxford, all of whom went through this medieval course of training, and all of whom have, with the exception of Pullman, so both of whom, I suppose, with Diana Wynne Jones and Susan Cooper, have incorporated quite a lot of medieval material, particularly folklore and ballad, in their writing. Philip Pullman was less of a medievalist and perhaps more of an early modernist, so the guiding principle behind his writing, if you like, is a response to Milton, at least in his Dark Materials. Philip Pullman told me that he liked studying English, he didn't like studying it at his particular college very much. Unfortunately, that college was this college. So we will not say any more about Philip's disobliging remarks about his tutor, who's anyway no longer with us. But as well as this kind of little cluster of English students, we also had Alan Garner, who was at Magdalen studying classics, at least, although he didn't complete his degree. And he was there around the same time as Diana Wynne Jones and Susan Cooper. Whether their paths ever crossed, I don't know. But his interests were not shaped by the English faculty syllabus in this way, but rather by his own reading and his own understanding of the landscape and traditions where he lived and still lives, of course, but also by this rigorous classics training, which allowed him to frame his own responses to place within a larger literary tradition. But more recently, we've had a group of writers who are not studying English literature. Samantha Shannon, who will be with us this afternoon, of course, did study English at St Anne's, but more recently. So she, I think, had a less rigorous grinding through philology and perhaps a more interesting and creative, more literary experience. Rebecca Kuang was here a few years ago doing a master's in contemporary Chinese culture. Catherine Rundell is also an English literature person, again situated somewhere between this Diana Wynne Jones, Susan Cooper generation and Samantha Shannon's generation. So I think she would have studied a slightly different version of the English syllabus from what we have now. But nevertheless, rather like Philip Pullman, her interests are in the early modern period as well. And then we have Sarah Mukhalrana, who we'll be hearing from this morning too, who is working in global studies at St Antony's, looking at politics and culture. So the kind of iron grip of the English faculty on the imagination of these writers is beginning to diminish, and perhaps that's a very good thing. So finally, I want to just turn to the question of the city itself. What is it about Oxford that inspires people, particularly to turn to medievalism? Oxford still has a medieval town plan, that basic crossroads centred on Carfax, and with the main roads going down the High Street, Carfax, Cornmarket, Queen Street. It still has its city walls. If you go to the Turf Tavern, you'll see, dividing the turf from New College, what remains of the medieval city walls. It has a picturesquely ruined castle up there on the mound. And it has, these are not necessarily medieval features, of course, but it has its rivers. It has the canal, it has the River Thames, it has the River Cherwell. It has its weirs, and I think the weirs, which represent in some ways a site where water is moving yet not moving, where these placid bodies of water suddenly become quite dangerous. You should try not ever to punt over a weir. That's a handy tip for later on this week, perhaps. It's full of alleyways with mysterious lighting. If you walk around the Radcliffe Camera by night, so if you go down Cat Street, you'll see no longer gas lights, but nevertheless old-style lampposts of the kind that we associate now with Lewis and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It still has cobbled streets, notoriously again round the Radcliffe Camera, but also in Merton Street. The botanical gardens, again, this is not a medieval feature, but it's something which has figured very largely in the work of Philip Pullman as a place that represents in little the kind of Garden of Eden in contrast to the bustle of the modern industrial city. I've mentioned the canal along with the rivers, but the canal too is extremely important for Pullman, and that idea of a community that's living alongside the industrial city and the university, but a community of free-thinking people. If you go and walk by the canal, you'll see all the houseboats down there, and you'll encounter people who are not just tourists passing through, though some of them will be on fun barge holidays, but many of them are people who are living there because they like that particular existence. And finally, we've got the expanse of Port Meadow as well. Medieval insofar as it's been established for 1,000 years, but also a huge open space. Again, something that's absolutely central to Philip Pullman's imagination. And so that's enough from me, I think, on Oxford. But I hope that at lunchtime or tea time or when we finish tomorrow, you'll have the opportunity to go out and explore it with the eyes of fantasy aficionados. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm very pleased to introduce our first full-length talk for today. We have Simon Horobin, who is Professor of English Language and Literature and Fellow and Tutor in English at Magdalen College, Oxford. He has published widely on medieval literature and the English language. He has lectured to a variety of audiences on C.S. Lewis and has published articles on Lewis's scholarly writings. He is the author of C.S. Lewis's Oxford, with Bodleian Publishing, which examines the role that Oxford, its colleges, libraries, chapels, common rooms, and pubs played in fostering the work of one of the 20th century's most influential writers and thinkers. So please welcome Professor Simon Horobin.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Grace, for the introduction. And this, I think, follows on quite neatly from what Carolyne's just been talking about, because what I want to think about is where the origins of Narnia lie, and particularly thinking about it in relation to C.S. Lewis's biography, his early years, but also particularly his Oxford life. And I thought that a useful starting point for that would be the moment when he first matriculated in Oxford. We have a nice photo here of his matriculation at University College in April 1917, and here he is with the entire student body at UNIF. It's quite telling, I think, isn't it, what sort of strange time it was to come up and be a student in Oxford. And in fact, Lewis himself, by November of that year, was also on the Western Front. But that's him back right, by the way, if you don't recognise him. And he's actually a student there of classics. So Carolyne was talking about the importance of the Oxford English course, but the classical course is obviously also important too, as we know and as you heard yesterday from Beppe Pezzini. And Lewis, unlike Tolkien, completed the Oxford Classics degree. I mean, with the break for fighting in the First World War, he came back, returned to Oxford at the beginning of 1919 and did his Classics degree, getting a double first. And then at the end of it, he set out to become an academic philosopher, in fact, applied for philosophy jobs, including one in classical languages and literature at Magdalen, but he was unsuccessful. We still have his rejection letter in the college archives. But in the meantime, his tutor suggested that it would be a good idea to do an English degree because there were more jobs going in English at that time, so it was a relatively new subject. He thought that would increase his opportunities to get an academic position. And given that Lewis had read much of the Oxford English course already, even though, as we heard, it was focused really on the Old and Middle English periods, that was essentially what Lewis read as a young man. So he was already pretty well read in that course, and in fact he did it in a year and graduated with another first. And at this point, Magdalen College advertised its first tutorial fellowship in English. This is in 1925, and Lewis successfully applied for it. So it turned out to be great advice from his tutor, because he snapped up a job quite soon afterwards. So he moved in to Magdalen, into the new buildings here in the summer of 1925. It's actually the centenary of that moment right now. And here he is sitting in his rooms, in those familiar surroundings that we often see pictures of him, surrounded by numerous pipes and inkwells and the tools of his trade, I suppose. And he was here from 1925 to 1954 when he moved to Cambridge. But of course he'd done much of his writing during that Oxford period. So again, I think this focus on Oxford is quite relevant thinking about Lewis too. And it's also in those rooms that he met with the Inklings, which is obviously another important group for thinking about Oxford fantasy, which sort of coalesced around Lewis and Tolkien. It was actually a group that began at University College. It was founded by one of the students there, and they gave it the name Inklings. But when the student left, the group fizzled out, and Lewis and Tolkien kept meeting, and then they took the group and the name to Magdalen, where it would meet on a Thursday night after dinner to read to each other from the work that they were writing. We all know about the Inklings and the Eagle and Child, which is also a regular meeting haunt, but actually that was a Tuesday morning sort of drinking and gossiping kind of event, rather than the serious business of reading to each other. So I think the importance of the interaction between these groups is obviously significant for Lewis, and it's worth remembering that he didn't begin his fantasy writing with Narnia. So this is a famous quotation from a letter that Tolkien wrote in the 60s about how they began the process of writing what for Lewis became space travel books, where apparently Lewis had said to Tolkien one day, "Tollers, there's too little of what we really like in stories. I'm afraid we shall have to try and write some ourselves." And we agreed that he should write space travel and I should write time travel. And so that's what led to Lewis writing Out of the Silent Planet, the first of what became a trilogy, Perelandra and then That Hideous Strength. And of course, Tolkien in the meantime wrote some of, but not very much of, The Lost Road. And the Inklings was a really quite productive period for Lewis. Those Second World War years is when he wrote much of his best-known works. The first of his apologetics, Problem of Pain, and then, as I said, Out of the Silent Planet, which was also read to the Inklings, the Screwtape Letters, then Perelandra, The Great Divorce. And in the meantime, Tolkien was reading what they called the New Hobbit book, which was obviously Lord of the Rings. And that's that famous Inklings letter, which you've probably seen reproduced in various books. It's a thank you letter that Lewis wrote to one of his American supporters who sent him food parcels during and after the war because of rationing. And they've just at this point eaten a ham that he sent and partaken of his health, drunk his health, and then they all sign it. So you can see we've got Lewis, we've got at the bottom J.R.R. Tolkien, but we also have Christopher Tolkien, who was invited along when he was a student here in Oxford, and he also read English, I should point out, in fact was taught by C.S. Lewis. But then other people too, some from the English faculty, so Hugo Dyson and Lord David Cecil, both members of the English faculty, but Colin Hardy was a tutor in classics at Magdalen. And then we've also got Havard, Robert Havard, who was Lewis's doctor, and Warnie Lewis, who was a returning soldier, Lewis's brother. So it's a bit more of a mixed group, but I think it does still focus in and around the university and particularly the study of English and classics. And one of the things to point out about this in sort of my prelude to thinking about Narnia is that what made Lewis famous, in fact, was the Screwtape Letters. You know, that's what makes him become a household name both here and in the USA. So for instance, you know, you may have seen this picture of him appearing on Time magazine, which was dated to September 1947. 1947, so that's when he's really become, you know, very big name in the US. And you can see the devil on his shoulder there, and it says Oxford C.S. Lewis, His Heresy, Christianity. So, it's a reference explicitly to Screwtape, the book that became such a bestseller. And the point to sort of emphasise there is that, of course, that's before he'd even begun publishing the Narnia stories. So this is what made him a big name. He even, in Britain, appeared in a photo shoot in Vogue magazine in July 1950. I don't know how many Magdalen Fellows have ever had a photo shoot in Vogue. I expect not many. Yeah, if I ever get invited to do one, I'm not going to do it in my dressing gown. It famously was very cold in the new buildings in that period, with sort of rationing on coal and no central heating. So he did teach in his dressing gown. But why he did the photo shoot in it, I have no idea. And what exactly that pose is supposed to be, I'm also unclear. Okay, so, and 1950 is actually the date of the first of the Narnia stories, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but it didn't come out until October of that year. So again, it sort of proves my point, I think, that he was still a household name, or at least he was very well known before the books for which he is best known today. So that brings me on to the Narnia stories, and particularly The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and to sort of address that question of where did this come from? Because actually, it's not an obvious move for a bachelor Don living in Magdalen College in his 40s, who's written some fantasy fiction, but also lots of Christian apologetics. At the time, he was working on his major contribution to scholarship, which was his volume for the Oxford History of English Literature, which took him so long that he always called it the Oh Hell volume. But he did eventually publish it. It's a major contribution to the study of the 16th century. So he was working on that. And you might think, well, why at that point would he decide to write a children's story? And why this particular kind of children's story? Well, of course, there are lots of different explanations, and probably the best known one, certainly if you hire an Oxford tour guide to take you around Oxford, this is the one that you'll be told, which is that it was walking out of St. Mary the Virgin, the University Church, one snowy winter's evening that he found himself in St. Mary's Passage with the lamppost, and then opposite him this doorway with these two strikingly gilded fawns on either side of it, and then carved into the wooden door what appears to be a lion's head that gave Lewis that moment where suddenly all those different features of the first Narnia story kind of coalesced in his imagination. So you've got Lucy going through the wardrobe and being confronted by Mr. Tumnus, the blanket of snow, the lamppost of Lantern Waste, and then subsequently Aslan. And that's obviously a great story. I'm somewhat sceptical of it, as I will explain, but I can see its power. And of course, when we talk about Lewis's Oxford, we need to think about the Oxford today and the way that Lewis has his own stories of part of the Oxford that we know today. And I sometimes take people around Oxford talking about Lewis's legacy. And I can be sure, in fact, I did it about a couple of weeks ago, went to that very spot to pour cold water on that very story. And no fewer than 3 different tourist groups turned up to tell exactly that story while I was there. So it kind of proved my point, but it also shows how powerful the story is. The reason why I'm sceptical of it, well, there are a number of reasons, but the key one, I suppose, is that Lewis gave a very different account of where the story came from. When he was interviewed and asked about it, he said, all 7 of my Narnia books and my 3 science fiction books began with seeing pictures in my head. At first, they were not a story, just pictures. The Lion all began with a picture of a fawn carrying an umbrella and parcels in a snowy wood. This picture had been in my head since I was about 16. Then one day, when I was about 40, I said to myself, let's try to make a story about it. So it's quite an intriguing account, isn't it? And Lewis himself casts scorn elsewhere, by the way, on accounts that authors give of how stories came to them, which makes you wonder about it. But he's very clear on the idea that it begins with pictures. Just as Tolkien says, it all began with names or words. For Lewis, it's visual. But it goes back to when he was about 16, which is before he ever set foot in Oxford. So if we want to be, sort of really literal about this, then it really can't have been that doorway that inspired him. But of course, that just pushes it back to his Belfast childhood. And of course, you won't be surprised to hear there are many lampposts in Belfast, and wardrobes and so on, that are claimed. And in fact, one particular wardrobe is this one, which is the one that now stands in the Marion Wade Center Museum at Wheaton College, just outside Chicago, which is the Lewis family wardrobe. It was carved by Lewis's grandfather. And when his father died, Lewis had it shipped over from Belfast so that he could have it in his Oxford home. So it was obviously an important wardrobe. And various stories have grown up about it and said that when he was a small boy, he used to sit in the wardrobe and tell stories to his brother. I don't know how easy it would be to sit in that wardrobe, but maybe I'm being too literal about all of this. And also being even more literal, the one in the story, we're told, is the sort of wardrobe that has a looking glass in the door, and this one doesn't. So again, that it fails the test in that regard. But should we think about fantasy in terms of trying to locate the real world inspiration for something? This, incidentally, is the house that Lewis grew up in, Little Lee in Belfast. It's the one he describes at the beginning of Surprised by Joy, when he says they moved from this small house to this enormous house in the countryside. And there was a little room at the end of the upstairs passage where his brother and he apparently used to go and write stories. Now that we can believe because many of those stories survive. A world that they created of talking animals called Boxen. And you might think, well, this is an obvious first sort of start on the Narnia stories. We've got animals talking who are dressed. But in fact, it lacks any of the kind of actual fantasy element. These are essentially behave and talk as if they were humans. And they talk about politics and things, and it's Lewis trying to be very grown up. And in fact, he says in Surprised by Joy that there was no trace of the kind of imaginative world which he was inhabiting and which he was reading extensively in, but he wasn't writing it really at that point. And I said that there were various inspirations around Belfast that are claimed, and here's the church where Lewis was baptised, which was where his grandfather was the minister, and this is the vicarage, and this is its doorknob, which again is, of course, there's a little plaque saying, this may have been the inspiration for Aslan. But another thing that Lewis himself did point to when he was asked about the inspiration for Narnia was that he said he got the name for the place from a classical atlas that he was using when he was a schoolboy. And this is that classical atlas, and here you probably don't know if you can make it out, but there is a place on it called Narnia. It's now Narni in Italy, and sort of hilltop town in Umbria. And he said that he was just looking through this map. So the Latin form of Narni is Narnia, and that he drew upon that name because he liked the sound of it. Again, that's interesting in relation to what I said about Tolkien and place names, I think. So Narnia was already there in his mind as an interesting name. Of course, he never went there or anything. I mean, Lewis, like Tolkien, was not well travelled at all. So that brings us then back to Oxford. I think I've sort of suggested that he got the idea, these pictures were in his mind when he was back in his teens, and he was obviously writing stories, reading widely, but it's not until in his 40s, when he's living in Oxford, that he decides to see if he can make a story about it. And we might wonder why at that particular point would he decide to do that. Well, I said he was living in the new buildings at Magdalen, so he moved in there in 1925. But in 1930, he also bought a family home on the edge of Oxford in Risinghurst, known as the Kilns. If you haven't been there, you can make an appointment. It's now a kind of study centre. owned by an American foundation, but you can make an appointment and go and have a guided tour of the kilns. It's been reconstructed to look exactly as it was when they lived there. It's not actually authentic, but it does give you the sense of it. And why this is significant, I think, is because in 1939, 4 schoolgirls were evacuated from London to avoid the bombing and brought to Lewis's house on the edge of Oxford. And throughout, they would sort of change over time. But throughout the war, he had these evacuee children living with him. And he writes very warmly about them to his friends at the time. And he says, I never really appreciated children until the war brought them to me. So I think that's a point where he's sort of looking back at his own childhood. He even says to his brother at one point, they keep saying, what shall we do? And he says, nothing like our childhood, because they were immersed in their stories and in their imaginative worlds. I think he's sort of somewhat frustrated and surprised at these children and their lack of imagination. But he obviously enjoys having them around. And so that I think is quite striking, not least because, of course, if we remember how the book opens, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, that is, it's with 4 children being evacuated from London to stay with a somewhat forgetful old professor living in a rambling house in the countryside. So it's not difficult to see where Lewis might be, why that might be the trigger that makes him think at this point, the children around, he's got a context for the book, and at that point he decides to see if he can make a story about it. We don't know exactly when that happened, but there is a first go which survives on the back of a page on a story called The Dark Tower, which was an unfinished science fiction story that Lewis had begun writing. Never finished, but on the back of one of those leaves is this aborted opening. And I'll show you just a transcription of it so you can see what it says. It says, this book is about 4 children whose names were Anne, Martin, Rose, and Peter. But it is most about Peter, who was the youngest. They all had to go away from London suddenly because of air raids and because father, who was in the army, had gone off to the war and mother was doing some kind of war work. They were sent to stay with a relation of mother's who was a very old professor who lived by himself in the country. So probably those of you who know the book well will recognise that that is very similar to the opening of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. But there are some kind of key and very striking differences, I think, aren't there? Let's have a look at the same beginning, but in the published version. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. So I suppose the most striking difference there is to do with the names of the children, and particularly to the fact that Peter, who the first one says this story is going to be mostly about, because he was the youngest, has now become the oldest. And Lucy, who's not mentioned before, has replaced him as the youngest. And of course, you could really say that the story is mostly about Lucy, in the sense that she's the person who first finds Narnia. And that change may well be related to the dedication that we find in the book, which is to a Lucy Barfield, the daughter of his great friend, fellow student and fellow Inkling, Owen Barfield. And he says, it's very sweet, this dedication. I'm just going to read it to you because it's so lovely. My dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realised that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you're already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday, you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather, C.S. Lewis. And that's Lucy Barfield in 1947. So he's clearly, in some senses, addressing this to a particular Lucy as well, and that's obviously part of the change that undergoes. But I think other than that, I mean, and the other obvious connection is that if we think of him as the doddery old professor who's living in the countryside, we'd also remember that he's called Professor Kirk, which is a nod to his old, not school teacher, because Lewis left school at about the age of 14 and went for private tuition in the English, in a village in Surrey, where he was taught by W.H. Kirkpatrick. And there's clearly, influences there. But other than that, I think we don't find many personal influences in the story as it is. So where do these ideas come from then? Where do some of the... what was it in Lewis's life at that time, and particularly his life as an Oxford English tutor, that may have influenced the stories? And I want to explore some of those things, going back to some of the things that Carolyne mentioned about the nature of the English course and how it might have influenced these stories. One feature of these stories, of course, in the Narnia stories, is that there are all kinds of strange beasts, mixtures of human and mythical beasts. There's a nice example of that where Edmund is walking through the witch's courtyard, where he's surrounded by these strange creatures that have been turned to stone. And he says there are lots of them standing around like pieces on a chessboard. And these include things like wolves, bears, catamountains, and dragons, and then later on, of course, there's even a kangaroo. One possible inspiration for that I'm sort of intrigued by, but I'm, as you know, sceptical of the idea that there are particular real-world influences, are these strange creatures that inhabit the cloisters at Magdalen College, standing like they're stone statues, rather like you get in the witch's courtyard. And it says in that description that they were like chess pieces on a board. And these are like little chess pieces sitting on their parapets around there. But again, it's tempting. But there's another important influence, I think. And if we look at another description of these strange mythical beasts, there's here the creatures that side with the White Witch in the story, we're told, are they're so terrifying that he can't describe them, because if he did, then the grown-ups wouldn't let the children read the stories. But he calls them cruels and hags and incubuses, wraiths, horrors, efreets, sprites, orkneys, woozes, and etins. Now, I suspect the children were wondering what these creatures were, because they'd have had to have done some pretty recondite reading as children to know what a wooz, an orkney, an etin, and so on were. But one thing that they could have been reading to find out would have been Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a text that, of course, Lewis was very familiar with as a young man, but also as a tutor. One of the standard features of any medieval syllabus, 14th century alliterative poem. And here you can see that Gawain, on his journey to find the Green Knight in the chapel, we're told that he fights against wyrmes, dragons and wolves, wodwoes, bulls and boars, and bears, and etains. So those are giants. So these are the etins, and the woozes is the wodwoes, and then we've got the wolves and the boars and the bulls. So many of the same creatures that are turning up with the White Witch here, you can also find in this description of Sir Gawain. And we know that Lewis was a very careful student of this poem, because his own copy actually survives, heavily annotated like all his books, even with some illustrations to help you make sure you understood all of the strange architectural, technical vocabulary that the poet uses there. And then etins, we find them not just at the on the side of the White Witch and the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but of course we find them in Etins Moor. This is Old English Eoten. That's that same line again, the giants, and you can see that Lewis is using Etins Moor, and these are the Etins that the children, Scrub and Paul and Puddleglum encounter in the Silver Chair. And you can see Eton Moors is also a feature of Middle-earth too. And then Wodwoes, that's the word that Lewis uses as woos, Wudu Waza, which means it's an Old English word for a wild man of the woods, a savage, a satyr or a faun. And I've given you a quote there from Lord of the Rings too, because again, Lewis and Tolkien are very similar in their way of sort of taking these medieval words and repurposing them in their fantasy worlds. And we know about Orc, I'm sure, so Orkney. So the White Witch also has the Orkneys on her side, and this is the Old English word orc, demon or evil spirit, which again, of course, is another feature of Middle-earth. Another obvious source for these kinds of beasts are these lines in Beowulf, in which the poet tries to explain, this is a Christian poet looking back on a pagan world and trying to understand how, in a world created good, could we have all these strange, monstrous creatures? And he says that they were all the progeny of Cain, the first murderer. And he says, along with those, we find Eotonas, that's the word, etins again, giants, and Orkneas, Orkneys, as Lewis would call them, the orcs for Tolkien, such giants who, for a long time, warred against God. And worms, this is the Old English word worm or dragon, which of course is a very important feature of Tolkien's world. Now we don't see that in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, in fact, but worms do make an appearance later on, of course, and this scene here, the conversation with Smaug, where Bilbo is trying to rescue the Arkenstone, where you've got a dragon on a hoard of treasure, does turn up also in Narnia, of course, because Lewis draws on precisely the same sources as Tolkien is drawing on here in that famous episode in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, if you remember, where Eustace finds himself confronted by a dragon. If you remember that Eustace, though, of course, has read all the wrong books. When he was a child, he read books of information instead of books of imagination. And it comes back to bite him when he finds himself confronted by a huge hoard of treasure, and he doesn't know what this might signify. So let me just read this bit to you. At the bottom of the cliff, a little on his left hand, was a low, dark hole, the entrance to a cave perhaps, and out of this 2 thin wisps of smoke were coming. And the loose stones just beneath the dark hollow were moving. That was the noise he had heard, just as if something were crawling in the dark behind them. Something was crawling. Worse still, something was coming out. Edmund, or Lucy, or you would have recognised it at once. You see, he's recalling that, of course, the reader does read books of imagination and fantasy. But Eustace had read none of the right books. The thing that came out of the cave was something he had never even imagined. A long, lead-coloured snout, dull red eyes, no feathers or fur, a long, lithe body that trailed on the ground, legs whose elbows went right up higher than its back, like a spider's. I don't know if dragons really have elbows, do they? But maybe that's the right word. Cruel claws, bats' wings that made a rasping noise on the stones, yards of tail, as the 2 lines of smoke were coming from its nostrils. He never said the word dragon to himself, nor would it have made things any better if he had. So here's a nice moment of encountering the fantastical and being unable to recognise it, being unable to recognise the danger that's clearly presented by a large hoard of treasure, because he'd read all the wrong books. And even more significantly, of course, what goes on to happen is, although you'd expect at this point there'd be some kind of big encounter between Eustace and the dragon, like, of course, we get between Bilbo and Smaug, that great kind of riddling conversation, which itself comes straight from Old Norse. Here, the dragon simply drops down dead. And it's a somewhat anticlimactic kind of moment. You think, that wasn't what I was expecting at all. And what Eustace does is it starts to rain. He goes and has a sleep in the cave. And then, of course, he wakes up and finds what you or I would have known, anyone who's read all the right books, is that if you go to sleep on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in your mind, you, of course, turn into a dragon. That's evidently what had happened to the dragon in the first place. And again, this goes right back to Volsunga Saga and to the Norse legends. And so, again, very like Tolkien, Lewis is drawing upon the stories that he knew well, both from his reading as a child, but also from his work within the Oxford English faculty. And so that's, I think, why the Oxford English course, particularly when it comes to Lewis and Tolkien, is such a critical part of both their fantasy worlds. And I think it's fair to say that we need to think also about the relationship between the two men, because they have a profound influence on each other. I think I sort of highlight the way in which they're both doing similar things, using similar kinds of ideas and words to create similar kinds of effects. Carolyne mentioned the fact that the course in those days was rigorously philological. And I think that I'm sure she meant it in a positive way. It wasn't fully implied. But Lewis, I think, came from a different tradition to Tolkien, in that he was more kind of literary inclined in his viewpoint. And in fact, there's that famous story of their first meeting, which very conveniently Lewis left an account of it in his diary. This was in May 1926, so not long after Lewis had got his job at Magdalen. Tolkien returned to Oxford from Leeds, and the two men met at a meeting of the English faculty. And they disagreed on a number of things. They disagreed on the value of the works of Edmund Spenser, which must have really irritated Lewis, because he was a great fan of Spenser. And Tolkien said he couldn't read it because of the forms. He didn't like the language. And then they disagreed on the prominence of language study to the English syllabus, very significantly. That was something that Lewis thought, that Tolkien thought was the real thing in the language school, as Lewis puts it. And Lewis was much more sceptical. So I think they did disagree quite heavily on the extent to which the syllabus should be rigorously philological, and to what extent it should be about reading literature. They both thought it should be about reading early literature. I mean, Lewis, again, thought that modern literature, you don't need to teach somebody how to blow their nose, he says. So why should you teach them how to read Dickens? And But so they both believed it should be focused on these periods, and so I think these texts were absolutely central to them. But Lewis was somewhat slower to come to an appreciation of philology, as it was, and that was really under the influence of Lewis. And in fact, the syllabus that Tolkien created in the 1930s, which is the very rigorously philological one, initially Lewis was quite sceptical of it, but Tolkien won him round. And he became one of his most sort of vociferous supporters as they pushed through these big and far-reaching changes to the syllabus. And in fact, in the 50s, when the whole issue of syllabus reform came up again, because it was by that time quite a lot of pushback against philology and against the idea that everything should stop at 1830, and there was a working group formed to decide on these matters. And they came up, and Tolkien was on the working group. They came up with proposals to change it. And when they were presented to the faculty, Lewis was outraged that Tolkien had gone against the syllabus they first both introduced. And he then went around campaigning so rigorously for keeping things status quo that even Tolkien voted against the proposals that he himself had put together. So it was very confusing, isn't it? That they then stuck with. So even in the 50s, this was still a rigorously philological kind of syllabus. But I think that's why it's so important, because these words like woos, etin, worm, and so on, are ones that they are, and I'm sure you heard something of this yesterday, thinking about Tolkien, the word ent. Again, he talks about the word ent, which is an Old English word for a giant, being a word that he wants to do something about. Because they're words that are sort of like blank checks in a way. We don't know precisely what they refer to. They refer to some creatures of olden times, and that allows you the potential to imagine what they might have been like. And I think that's a kind of spur to both men, so Lewis just as much as it is to Tolkien. Good, so I think at that point I'm going to draw things to a conclusion, and then I'm very happy to take any questions that anyone might have. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a fair amount of time for questions. So we're going to do a combination of ones in the room and ones online. So does anyone in the room have a question? Yes.
Thank you.
So when I remember back to when I was a child and first met Larrington wardrobe, one of the most memorable scenes to me was when Edmund meets the witch and is treated to Turkish delight and hot chocolate in a sleigh. I was interested, I didn't actually know much about C.S. Lewis's history, and just mentioned he wasn't very well travelled, so I guess I'm curious, where did Turkish delight come from? Is there any
Yeah, that's a good question. One I've pondered a lot. So Turkish connections, aslan is the Turkish word for a lion. And he says he met that in the Tales of the Arabian Nights. And he used it because he liked the sound of it. But he also liked the fact that it has the word ass. He pronounced it aslan because ass is the Norse word for a god. So it's an interesting name, and it's Turkish. So that I don't think explains or answers your question, but it sort of hints at a Turkish connection. And I suppose the other thing is, if you read stories at the time, children's books that he read, Edith Nesbit and so on, Turkish delight does pop up as a kind of fairly standard sweet treat. I don't know how many other kinds of sweet treats he would have known. But the other one that intrigues me, but you can pour scorn on this if you like, but at Magdalen College, after we have a thing called second dessert in Oxford, which is you've eaten dessert already, and then someone says, "Do you want some dessert?" And you think that's odd. And this is where different colleges do it differently, but it's essentially a collection of sort of exotic fruits, port, chocolates, and so on. But one thing we have at Magdalen, which I have not yet found at any other college's second dessert, is Turkish delight. So perhaps he was inspired by his own experience of eating it or a particular love of it. I don't know. Or maybe we have it at Magdalen because of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. I don't know. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And I'm now wondering if second dessert was the inspiration for second breakfast.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Okay, do we have any online questions?
Yeah, we do. One of the questions online we have has to do with the use of Old English words by Lewis. And the question is, do you think that this caused Old English words to get popular in more recent fantasy?
I would guess so, but I don't know enough about more recent fantasy to know if that's where they're getting it from, and what the specific examples would be, but that seems rather likely, doesn't it? And I don't know if the person asking has a particular example, but I guess it's either there or it's going back to the medieval sources themselves. So in some cases it might be that, but I would have thought that, that to some extent that is being the more likely source, yeah.
Okay, a question in the room? Yes.
Thank you very much for this. I really enjoyed it. And I especially enjoyed what you were saying at the end, sort of about the difference between Lewis and Tolkien on philology and Lewis's more sort of literary sensibilities. And forgive me if you touched on this and I missed it, but there's a scholar, Michael Ward, who's written about kind of the cosmological background to Lewis's approach, and it's sort of suggested that if you look at things like the Cosmic Trilogy, the Space Trilogy, and some of his poetry, the Discarded Image, these things that have to do with sort of the sense of the medieval cosmology, this might be in fact one of Lewis's stronger drives, and that even you might see each of the planets represented in the chronicles themselves. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, thanks. I think that he spotted something that's important about and he uses the term atmosphere of the stories, which, Lewis wrote about atmosphere being a really key part of storytelling, didn't he? That famous essay on stories, which talks about how, why do we go back to our favourite stories? It's surely not for the plot because we know what's going to happen. It's because of the atmosphere. And I think, Michael Ward coined the term Donegality for, why do you go back to Donegal all the time? And what is it about Donegal? And it's the same for any place, the sort of Oxonianness of Oxford or something. And I think that this kind of these planetary elements that he has identified are important and telling. So, for instance, that he associates the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with Jupiter. It's about kingship and so on. I think there are lots of sort of important kind of resonances that come out from having that foregrounded in the way that he's done in his book. But I slightly shy away from the kind of Narnia code type side of it, which is what the kind of popular version of Planet Narnia was called, because it suggests that was the kind of key to understanding these stories, and that Lewis set out to hide it within them, and that it was there to kind of, to explain them in some way. And I think that just takes it too far, and not least because it's clear that Lewis wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a one-off. And he didn't really intend to write a series of books at that point. And at the end of it, he then starts thinking about a sequel. One imagines the publisher is contacting him at the time, and he's thinking, well, I've probably got more I can say. But he's casting around for ideas at that point. He's got plenty of them. I mean, his imagination is constantly bubbling up, I think. But he's not planned ahead in the way that you would have to if you're thinking about it as a series of planetary novels. And then I think it does start to get going as a series, and it's only really, I would say, towards the end of it that he specifically and explicitly in a letter to some children says that there are going to be 7 of them. So he has decided it at that point, but he certainly hasn't at the beginning. I think it's much more happenstance. And I can see how he might think, I'm going to write a book about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's going to involve kingship and Jupiter, and things associated with Jupiter are going to be prominent. But that I don't think means that the whole series was intended to, or that somehow it's a bit reductive in its most extreme form, that idea, I would say. But it's a really rich book. I would say, if anyone who hasn't read Planet Narnia, it's really worth reading. It's very scholarly. There's lots to get out of it.
Is there another online question?
No, we're fine. Thank you.
Another question from the room?
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, you said C.S. did complete his classics degree, and obviously Tolkien tried. Why do you think the study of English that they then go on to do kind of supersedes all the classical kind of influences they might have had? It seems like all that sort of right territory isn't as big a deal to them as the later stuff is. Why do you think the North stuff wins, basically?
Well, I suppose I could say, for instance, if it starts with an image of a faun standing in a snowy wood, then you could say the classical literature is still fairly prominent. I don't think, because of course part of what Tolkien seems to object to in Narnia is that it isn't just a kind of a consistent worldview. It's a jumbling of mythologies and literatures, and therefore the classical side of it, Dionysus turns up and Bacchus, and there are lots of classical moments in Narnia, and so I don't think that's all gone away. But could it have been superseded? Perhaps, because I think maybe that is a more productive mode for Lewis, in particular, the medieval. But I think he's still, that there are moments where Milton and Shakespeare and there's a richness to Narnia, which obviously Tolkien, it didn't appeal to Tolkien in that, if that's to be believed. But I think that is what Lewis is doing. For instance, one obvious example of the Miltonic influence would be the creation of Narnia. What he calls the founding of Narnia in The Magician's Nephew, where Aslan is sort of singing the world into being, and the animals start to appear. If you remember, they come up from under the ground and start bursting through the earth, and then you've got these sort of strange branching twig-like things. It turns out to be the antlers of a deer that comes up through the ground, and then this sort of big baggy trousered elephant comes up. And he's just got this directly from Milton's description of creation in Paradise Lost. So, I think Lewis is a bit of a magpie, and all the things that he likes turn up in Narnia, and that's classics. It's some classical stuff as well as it is all kinds of English literature.
Okay, any questions in the room? Yeah.
Thanks again so much for the talk. It's so fascinating.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, I don't know if I read somewhere or that Narnia came after The Hobbit, and he was possibly inspired to write a children's story because The Hobbit had been so successful. Is that right?
Well, there's a bit of a gap, but it certainly came after it. And obviously the dating around The Hobbit is slightly tricky as well, but we know that Lewis was given a copy of the manuscript in the early 1930s to read it. It didn't get published until 1937. And again, that's largely because, of course, Tolkien wasn't planning to publish it himself. He wrote it for his children. And that's, again, where there's an interesting contrast, but the first of these people I mentioned to write a children's story was actually Owen Barfield, who wrote The Silver Trumpet, which came out in 1925. And he lent it to Lewis, who lent it to Tolkien, who read it to his children. And it was a great favourite with them, he says. So he actually began that process. But Barfield and Tolkien had children that they were reading to, and that's how the stories kind of emerged. Lewis did read The Hobbit early on and enthused greatly about it. And of course, he was a big believer in, reading fairy tales when you're a grown-up. As he says to Lucy, you might go off them for a bit, but you'll be old enough one day to read them again. So in that sense, I think that The Hobbit could have inspired him as a concept, but it's quite a bit earlier than when he sits down to write the Narnia story. So yeah, it must have made a difference that his friends had written children's stories, I suppose. And interesting what you suggest about maybe the success of it, as if perhaps he's thinking, like the sort of, oh look, there's money to be made in these books. But I don't think Lewis thought in those terms really. Like he says, there's one other article where he's being asked about the origins of the Narnia stories, and he said it was one of those moments in my life where write a fairy story was what I had to do or burst. So it's coming from within him, I think, largely. He doesn't really, again, explain what he means by that, but there's something he needed to get down. And the fairy story, he says, was the only mode in which I could write it. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm just going to read out loud the question, which is in two parts, and it's up to you which one you answer first. So the question is it ever going to be possible to create a fantasy atmosphere or universe that is not steeped in the classical mythology, legends, folk and fairy tales, language and locations such as Oxford that inspired the fantasy pioneers like Tolkien and Lewis, and something closer to C.S. Lewis? And then where does the Pelandra trilogy differ sit in relation to fantasy versus sci-fi? So I guess.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last bit of that. Whether.
So I guess the question is, where does the Pelandra trilogy sits in relation to fantasy and sci-fi? Kind of, do we talk about it as sci-fi or is it fantasy still? Thank you.
I don't know. That's for somebody who really knows about the sci-fi genre. I would think that by modern standards, it's pretty poor sci-fi. He's got no interest in any of the technical stuff, how you get to Mars and making it remotely believable. It's more of a kind of, well, he calls it kind of sort of philosophical sci-fi, I think. Maybe it's much closer to kind of H.G. Wells, that kind of writing, than it is modern sci-fi, I suspect. And the first question was about, is it possible to write fantasy without... No, you have to do an Oxford English degree. I think we're making that abundantly clear, aren't we? You have to read Beowulf, you have to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the original language, study your Etins and Woozes, and then you're all set. But no, of course you can make things up, can't you? That's the beauty of it, I guess. But it's obviously a rich and productive way of sort of drawing on. I mean, Tolkien in particular, I guess, but I think Lewis too has had an important influence on modern fantasy writing.
I think we have time for one more question from the room. Thank you.
Do you think that Lewis, in taking inspiration from all of the things around him, is perhaps uncreative, writing stories about Sharp and Penelope Sill? Or do you think that we should copy him and also take inspiration from the mundane world around us?
He has a great quote, doesn't he, about about what it means to read about fantastical worlds and magical woods and things. And so he says that it's in answer to the, does it mean that everything seems greatly mundane when you've read a fantasy story and then you're back in the real world? And he says reading about enchanted woods doesn't make everything else seem completely mundane, but it makes real woods just a little bit enchanted. And I think that's what he wants to do, is not leave us in this kind of mundane world, but actually to try and see how, in fact, the world that we live in is full of these kinds of amazing and enchanting kind of concepts, and see those potentially as an inspiration to write fantasy. You don't have to think of all other wardrobes as being completely, just boring old functional wooden wardrobes, but actually could be all themselves as slightly enchanted and portals into anywhere else you might want to go.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, there's time.
Okay, is there one online? Okay, so we can take one more from the room. Yes.
is Dr. Felix Taylor with Queen's College, Oxford. Felix Taylor is a writer and librarian here at Oxford. He completed his E.Phil here at Welshman folklore and modern British fiction. His book on literature and art of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn will be published early next year.
Thanks very much. I apologise at first because it's quite a tonal shift, a tonal leap between Oxford fantasy and C.S. Lewis and weird fiction. I've been trying to think of some correspondences between the two, and I think this is Algernon Blackwood, who's a weird fiction author. Dates similar to C.S. Lewis, and Lewis definitely read Blackwood, I think, as a teenager. And there's also an apocryphal story that Tolkien got the phrase "cracks of doom" from one of Blackwood's tales. So there is a link, I promise. Right. So weird fiction, weird tales, the weird, new weird, however you've heard it described. Weird as an adjective to talk about the kind of horror and supernatural fiction that people like Edgar Allan Poe were writing in the early 19th century is obviously not a modern term. Authors like Sheridan Le Fanu, Bram Stoker, Walter Scott, they were described as weird by critics well into the 1890s. It wasn't until the American pulp magazine Weird Tales started to be published in the 1920s that weird fiction began to take on a life of its own as part of the genres that we think of these days as horror, science fiction, and fantasy. Writers became proud to label themselves as weird fiction writers, and they delighted in corresponding between each other as connoisseurs of the weird. But it's a slippery term, weird, particularly applied to literature and film, and it needs a definition. Some critics have called it a subgenre, others a mode. But how does it differ from, or rather, how does it infect or alter the kind of traditional speculative literature that people think of when they imagine fantasy literature or horror literature? So the American New England writer H.P. Lovecraft had a lot to say about the weird tale, and he spent quite a lot of time trying to define exactly what he thought it was. Whether you like his writing or not, we have to reject his racism and his prejudicial politics, but any discussion of the weird has to take into account his early definitions. He had this to say in his essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature. The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form, clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension of defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our own safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. So you can kind of see why weird has been associated a bit more with the horror genre than any other speculative genre. But what exactly is he saying here? If we just go back, something more than the secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form. Lovecraft was writing in the 1920s, and here he's looking back at the kind of romantic Victorian tradition of the Gothic, and where a lot of these things were kind of commonplace. And while he admired writers like Anne Radcliffe or Mary Shelley, people that were using these tropes early on, he kind of rejects them as something that is part of the true weird tale. But this is where it gets a bit more interesting. An unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present. So For Lovecraft, the weird is cosmic in scope, outer forces, by which he means outside of our normal understanding of time and space. Lovecraft was an atheist. He rejected the idea of the spirit completely. He was a materialist. He was very interested from an early age in astronomy, looking at the universe. He was very aware of how big the universe was and how small humankind was in comparison to it. And it was this kind of this sense of kind of our inability to perceive that universe and our insignificance that was the true kind of terror at the core of the weird tale for Lovecraft. There is something that is out there that science has not yet discovered. It enters our world, however fleetingly, and is so indescribable and incomprehensible that many Lovecraft protagonists go mad. No, not yet. Atmosphere, which kind of links with what Simon was saying about C.S. Lewis and the fantasy tale. Atmosphere is also a very key word to describe the weird. Plot is secondary to the sensation of emotion which the weird evokes. So Lovecraft goes on, the one test of the really weird is simply this: whether or not there be excited in the reader a profound sense of dread and of contact with unknown spheres and powers, a subtle attitude of awed listening, as if for the beating of black wings or the scratching of outside shapes and entities on the known universe's utmost rim. Terrifying. There are, of course, other weird writers other than H.P. Lovecraft writing at this time. One writer in particular, the Welsh writer Arthur Machen, had a completely different approach to the weird. He didn't conceive of it in terms of the weird. I don't think he ever used that word really. But he was more spiritual. He was more of a mystic. He believed that the material world, beyond it, lay a kind of spiritual truth, and that through the weird experience you could kind of uncover it and have a kind of transformational experience. And it could be horrifying, but it could also be very joyful. So two very different conceptions there. Transgression also seems to be a key element to any form of the weird, the idea of a boundary being crossed. The science fiction writer China Miéville, who's a 21st century writer, talks about the weird of the Lovecraft period in revolutionary terms. He says, traditional monsters were now profoundly inadequate, suddenly nostalgic in the epoch of modern war. Out of this crisis of traditional fantastic, the burgeoning sense that there is no stable status quo, but a horror underlying the everyday. And more recent attempts to define the weird focuses on its ontological implications, particularly as a way to disrupt systems around us that we take for granted. So the weird in this conception is uncanny. It's Freud's unheimlich. It's eerie, but it's deeper than that. It's more powerful. Something that challenges the very structures of reality. So there are I've identified kind of three main stages of the weird in literature. There are people who like to split it into two, the early period and the late period, but I think there are grounds to argue that there are three very distinct periods that each develop what the weird becomes. So the very early stage is the kind of late 19th century, where you've got writers like Algernon Blackwood on the left there. He started off as quite a conventional ghost story writer, but he became very intensely interested in things like theosophy and the occult and spiritualism, and this began to infect or influence what he later wrote. His tales got longer, focused a lot more on atmosphere. Lovecraft's favourite weird tale was called The Willows by Blackwood, and this was this enormous tale, a very brooding story about two men who go canoeing down the Danube in Europe. And during the night, the willows on the banks, they start to whisper and move eerily, and there's a kind of hint that they're opening another dimension. And then you have Arthur Machen that I've already mentioned. He started writing in the 1890s with novels like The Great God Pan and The Three Impostors, but then his writing got a bit more spiritual. He started focusing on Celtic Christianity and the Holy Grail and that kind of thing. C.S. Lewis owned a copy of his novel The Secret Glory, so there's a kind of another correspondence there going on. And then to the right there, you've got M.R. James, which might be the most recognisable name in this trio. And again, ghost stories. He was kind of thought to have perfected the ghost story in the early 20th century. But what makes his stories weird is a kind of, again, it's the transgression, it's the bringing out these old academics or antiquarians digging in the ground and bringing out these secrets that shouldn't have been uncovered. So bringing the past into the present and all the implications that follow. Second era, the American pulp era. So this is when pulp magazines, pulp literature started to become very popular. Very, very cheap magazines, sensational subject matter, often very hurriedly written and, doing it for the money. So a lot of it is quite bad. A lot of it is very good. I'd say the vast majority is quite bad, but there are gems. I'm getting a sign that says time up. Have I reached my...
If we want questions, then yes.
Yes, okay. I'll just do the third period, which is the New Weird. And this is this is China Mieville, who's a British writer, M. John Harrison, British writer, and Caitlin Kiernan, who is an American writer, and they're almost like postmodern weird. They take inspiration from a lot of different places. They write urban fantasy. And there's a debate as to whether the weird has continued or whether it stopped in the early 2000s, and I'm not sure, and we can talk about that in the questions if you like. There we go.
Due to time limitations, we just have time for one question from the room. Yes.
Could you speak a little bit about influences from different kinds of media that may have influenced like fiction, like horror movies or like video games that have become quite common in modern day?
Yeah. Do you mean influences that the original authors...
I suppose either way, like how the original weird fiction has influenced what we think of as horror today across media, and also whether across media we can now consider that in the weird category.
We can definitely talk of weird cinema, and that's definitely a thing these days. And it's think of directors like Guillermo del Toro, the Mexican director, whose films Pan's Labyrinth, What We Do in the Shadows, What We Do in the Dark. He's very explicit in his influences. Some of those films even reference Arthur Machen by name, or an author like William Hope Hodgson, who was also writing around that time. And those films are definitely in the weird category. Pan's Labyrinth, you've got a young girl going into this underground other world, ruled over by a faun. So you've got kind of classical influence in there, but and then you have I think the best instance of a weird film for me is Under the Skin by Jonathan Glazer, which is about an alien who comes to this world and takes the form of Scarlett Johansson on a motorbike, and it's intensely weird.
Well, we have to close the session now, but please join me in thanking Felix.